Okay. Good morning, everyone in Brazil. Good afternoon in Kenya. My name is Cristine Severo. I'm going to mediate this presentation today. This is the annual conference of the International Association for the Integrational Study of Language and Communication, and is being hosted by the postgraduate program of Linguistics at the Federal University of Santa Catarina in Brazil. It's my pleasure to introduce you to our speakers. We had some technical problems, so Dr. Makoni is still, maybe he had some problems. So I'm going to introduce you Dr. Vicky Telewaro. She's an associate professor of applied linguistics in Laikipia University in Kenya. She has been teaching Laikipia University since 1997 and is now the Dean of the School of Humanities and Development Studies. She has supervised more than 17 graduate students. Her research interests are in doing applied linguistics in African contexts, particularly language in education policies, discourses of gender, religion, politics and governance, refugees, and environment. Some of her publications include the Samburu Traditional Communicative Ornamentation, Identity and Female Genital Mutilation, English is Must of Us, Languages and Education in Kakuma Refugee Camp in Kenya, and Proverbs of Peace in the Luhia and Swahili of Kenya. And I also introduced Dr. Sinfree Makoni. He teaches in the Department of Applied Linguistics and Program in African Studies at Pennsylvania State University in the United States. He is an extraordinary professor at the University of the Northwest South Africa, and he's also an Andrew Carnegie Fellow at Laikipia University in Kenya. His research is largely into colonial linguistics, language policy and planning, Southern epistemologies, and philosophies of language. Some of his recent books are Innovations and Challenges in Applied Linguistics from the Global South with Alistair Pennycook, and Integrational Linguistics and Philosophy of Language in the Global South, edited together with Daring Verity and Anna Kuyper Markers. And our third member of this roundtable is David Bade. Unfortunately, he had some technical problems to access internet, but I'm going to introduce him. He has sent us his bio, his interesting bio. David Bade was born on a small farm in Illinois at the height of the Cold War. So now we can see why he had some technical problems. The rise of industrial agriculture meant that there was not enough income on the farm for it to support him and his brothers. So he went to the University of Illinois to study languages. Since a specific degree he was required, he could not simply study languages. He decided to study linguistics, thinking that it ought to have some relation to language. It sort of did, at least if you think that the colorless green ideas sleep furiously. He studied the Khmer-tonal system in a field methods class and thus began a lifelong interest in language in Africa and language as song. Yet, since he could not write a dissertation in verse, much less whistle like the Meru do, he took a job in a library where his linguistic-oriented interests were satisfied, and he continued to work in libraries until he was able to retire and return to the farm. While shearing sheep and mending fence, he continues to ponder the nature and meaning of birth, death, race, gender, a kind word, a smile, and the relationship between love and justice. This is our beautiful and inspiring round table today. So their interesting talk is about the role of proverbs in African political discourses. So Dr. Makoni, Dr. Vicky, and Dr. David, thank you very much for your virtual presence today here. Now it's your turn. I'm going to share these slides, all right?
Okay. Good morning in Brazil, good afternoon in Kenya, and good day, the rest of you, wherever you are. I'm still waiting for my colleagues to connect. I'm supposed to be in the middle but I guess I'll start because I'm already here. But if the others come, oh, David is there. Welcome, David. I'm happy to see David is here. I think he'll probably start.
All right, I will start out. I give a really brief history of our project in a few sentences. Sinfree asked me to do something for this conference, and I said I don't have time and I don't know anything. Don't have a library. So I said, but you know what? If you had a student or somebody who could work with me, I would really like to write something on Cornelis Castoriadis or African Proverbs. And he said, well, don't care about Castoriadis, but I'd love to do something on Proverbs and I'll work with you. And I have friends, he said. That's how Vicky got involved. So actually, when I read Vicky's earlier paper on Proverbs, I thought, well, she's already got what we need right there. All we need to do is look at it from an integrationist perspective. So basically, Sinfree and I are going to do a drum roll for Vicky. I'm pretty much have the background in integrationism. Sinfree's the only one who's got the Southern theory down pat. So Sinfree and I are going to do Southern theory and integration, just a brief introduction, and then really Vicky did all the work. So she gets the top billing and she will do all the real work here. But I will just begin with some brief introductions here about what, Proverbs and integrationism and the problem that we're tackling. Okay. Speaking or writing in Proverbs and speaking or writing about Proverbs are not the same activities. The first is a linguistic activity, while the second is both a linguistic and a metalinguistic activity. The great difficulty when engaged in a metalinguistic discourse, such as this paper, is to avoid reification, to keep ourselves from assuming that the things, practices, concepts which we have named have a reality that precedes and presumably persists beyond the life of our empirical examinations and theoretical explorations. Yet that does not mean that we are talking about unrealities or imagined realities. We are talking about African realities, but we do not claim that our words in themselves contain or delimit the whole of that reality that interests us. The word proverb itself illustrates both the reality of interest to us and the impossibility of claiming some precise and scientific one-to-one correspondence between our word proverb and that reality of which we wish to speak. Proverbs, Ruth Finnegan noted, are not always distinguished by a special term from other categories of verbal art. This indicates a critical problem for the lexicographer and the paremiologist. Are the categories of verbal art, such as proverb, a scholar's fictions, artifacts of a particular analysis, or the lexicon of a culturally biased perspective? Are proverbs of widespread linguistic cultural phenomena, or is the identification of some speech act or image as proverbial a widespread form of metalinguistic or semiological analysis, either of folk origin or in an academic discipline known amongst professional students as paremiology? Later in the same chapters that quoted above, Finnegan elaborated upon the matter. The close connection of proverbs with other literary forms raises a difficulty. I'm quoting Finnegan here. It's kind of hard to quote in a paper, isn't it? How, particularly in an oral culture, can we distinguish proverbs from other forms of oral art, or indeed from ordinary cliches and idioms, and from such related but different forms as maxims and apophthegms? Most of the published collections ignore this point of definition, and by merely entitling their words proverbs, often give the misleading impression that these sayings are clearly differentiated from other expressions, or that they are in all ways equivalent to our idea of proverbs, end quote. Alan Dundes went straight to the heart of the matter in his remark about, quote, the inevitable controversy as to whether the units of analysis we are really in the data, God's truth, or are only a heuristic device found exclusively in the mind of the analyst, hocus pocus, end quote. But he immediately set the controversy aside in order to offer his structural analysis and the corresponding definition, concluding his paper with the caveat, insofar as proverbs are traditional propositions, they should properly be studied by scholars with expertise in symbolic logic and related disciplines. Apparently, he did not count himself among such scholars, and certainly I don't. Some paremiologists and others writing of proverbs attempt a definition of proverb, but many more either offer someone else's definition or offer, as Finnegan did, some general agreement as to what constitutes a proverb. Dundes believed that the proverb may best be defined in structural terms and gave as his definition, the proverb appears to be a traditional propositional statement consisting of at least one descriptive element, a descriptive element consisting of a topic and a comment. I would say if you can recognize a proverb from that definition, no power. Okay. Sorry, I couldn't help that little aside there. Villiers wrote, quote, as for the term proverb, it will be used to refer to self-sufficient utterances with a generic meaning involving mankind that are not associated with a specific author and that are current among the folk and consequently have a stable form. Of course, the camel in Vicky's Proverbs doesn't quite fit under that involving mankind, but maybe he wasn't studying African proverbs. Okay. Omenya stated only that proverbs are tested wisdom with considerable authority, and Ademowa Balogun wrote, proverbs are the simple truths of life that contain the moral values of society. Velasco came to the conclusion that, and here you'll have to forgive my Portuguese, I am no David Baloso or Christine Severo. Os proverbos são tradicionais do folclore de uma comunidade, frutos da experiência do povo, são afirmações concisas e impressões de verdades gerais. A sua formulação é genérica, é o seu valor de verdade é universal, atemporal e alocativo. Hope you could understand that, Christine. A Swedish scholar, Vidbeck, refrained from coming to conclusions, offering instead a list of criteria that can be used to distinguish proverbs from most other physiological units, and gave her working definition, quote, proverbs are relatively short, independent units that express truth and wisdom learned from life. They are also generalizable, anonymous, and assertive. She wrote that in Swedish, but I can't read Swedish, so I spare you that. Okay. Meader and Dundes, commenting on Finnegan's discussion of African proverbs in her book, Oral Literature in Africa, noted that we find in her remarks many of the critical issues found in proverb studies generally: definition, structure, style, context, function, and meaning. From that comment alone, we can see what is, from an integrationist perspective, the chief failure of what Rosemary Beck has called the classical notion of proverb. The one glaring omission is the one person speaking in proverbs. Just as Beck sought to reinterpret several of the issues given prominence in paremiological studies, out of context, citation, fixedness, style, so we seek to reconsider proverbial communication in light of integrational theory, with particular reference to speaking proverbially in political contexts. By considering proverbs to be the products, oral, written, drawn, painted, pantomimed, of someone in an always unique communication situation, our research proceeds with a reorientation towards the proverb maker and can thus dispense with the need to define the term proverb. Insofar as what paremiologists call proverbs can be closely related to riddles, stories, maxims, parables, allegories, poems, fables, moral tales, and in some cultures identified locally with the same term, we have no wish to force a foreign analytical framework onto a variety of differing local cultural linguistic practices. Finnegan reminded her readers that the decision as to whether or not some attractive saying is really a proverb depends on the local evaluation of it. And that attitude towards lay understandings is exactly in line with the integrational approach to the layman's understanding. Later in that same paragraph, Finnegan herself suggested the approach that we have adopted. Quote, therefore, to differentiate those sayings which are merely idiomatic from those which the people concerned consider to have that special flavor which makes it correct to call them proverbs, we need more precise information about context and attitude than we are usually given. So with plenty of context and at least as much attitude, we're going for broke. A few words on integrationism here. Roy Harris used the term integrational semiology partly in response to a complaint by the Berlin linguist Hans Heinrich Lume, who claimed the phrase integrational linguistics for his own theory several years before Harris began using it, and partly because Harris's theoretical perspective rather quickly moved towards a more encompassing theory of sign making and the diverse forms of human communicative activity. Although Harris coined a few neologisms and phrases, his theoretical discussions ride very little on technical terminology, for he offers no theoretical entities in need of names. Instead of pro and merge and a growing number of hypothesized cognitive structures and operations, in his writings, we encounter people speaking, hearing, writing, reading, drawing, singing, questioning, answering, debating, performing music, misunderstanding, repeating, restating, contradicting, imploring, interpreting road signs, responding to body language, applying the law, making peace, and pronouncing some couple husband and wife. Harris used lay language for an approach to communication that makes communication as we experience it its object of study. With its focus on the language maker, integrational semiology rejects the notion that our object of study is or should be a language that exists independently of us and which we use for communicational purposes, as well as the more extreme claim that such a language is an organical structure, in Chomsky's phrase, for generating syntactic structures that has evolved within the human brain and which the human species at some point accidentally discovered could be used for communication. Instead of the language, words or proverbs meaning something, the language is understood to be the product of our making something, sounds, marks, gestures, mean what we hope our interlocutor will understand in a particular situation. In Hutton and Pable's words, quote, linguistics and many other disciplines rely on the idea of languages as fixed codes that are held to make meanings available for us to use in particular contexts, the language myth. Integrationism denies that our communicational activity has any underlying guarantee or set of fixed reference points. We are always in the middle of a temporal and communicational stream, and the reference points we use are shifting along with us, end quote. One consequence of making language a product of communicational activity instead of an autonomous system used for communicating is that communication and language making are both understood to be necessarily creative processes. And creativity in this view is not the Chomsky generation of an infinite number of well-formed strings. The sort of creativity that integrationists have in mind is one which brings us and our worlds together. In fact, a making of worlds and all the relationships that they require in order to bring times and spaces, people and things, memories and dreams into an active conscious life. As Hutton and Pable put it, quote, communication is a creative process which involves an unbounded and unknowable number of factors and viewpoints, and through which individuals constantly adjust, assess, and contextualize and recontextualize their experiences and practices in the light of the unfolding situation. In communicating, we integrate aspects of the situation we are in, including the ongoing behavior of people present with our past, present, and anticipated experience in ways that are not knowable in advance, even by ourselves. Nothing is given in advance in communication. Signs are created in the here and now. The relationship between words and ideas and words and things is not fixed, end quote. Harris argued that all communication takes shape within a world constrained by three kinds of factors: biomechanical, macrosocial, and circumstantial. The tongue, the ear, and the hand are the main biomechanical factors providing the possibilities and limits for certain forms of language, though one can also communicate by nods and winks and shimmers and shakes. That this essay is written in what some would call standard English is due to the fact that none of the three authors is comfortable writing in Portuguese or Estonian, as well as the unlikelihood of tenure committees in the United States giving much weight to a paper written in Swahili. And shame on them for that. All are matters relating to the larger social worlds in which the authors live and write, that is, macrosocial factors. The fact that we can and are writing one paper, though living on separate continents, is due to the circumstance that we are all able to communicate using email, a circumstantial factor. Alongside these three factors is the shaping of communication, Harris proposed what he termed the principle of contemporality. Hert and Pable describe this practice thus. We quote them a lot, but we like them. Quote, "This principle is based on a simple lesson of linguistic experience, that what is said is immediately applicable to the current situation, unless there is a reason to suppose otherwise. But this holds not only for what we say, but for everything we do. In other words, in this respect, there is a complete parity of status between linguistic acts and other acts. Linguistic acts do not have some special temporal status of their own, which somehow puts them outside the sequentiality of the rest of our existence. This might be thought to be an extremely banal observation, and in one sense it is, but it is perhaps worth calling a principle when we realize how far-reaching its implications are for linguistic inquiry." End quote. To our orientation towards the language maker, the related recognition that language is the product of a person communicating, the three constraints on communication, and the principle of cotemporality, we need to only add two theoretical axioms to have the fundamental orientations and assumptions that underwrite an integrationist approach to language and communication. We're going to quote Hutton and Pable again. Quote, "Integrationist semiology is based on two theoretical axioms. What constitutes a sign is not given independently of the situation in which it occurs or of its material manifestation in that situation. Two, the value of a sign, its signification, is a function of the integrational proficiency which its identification and interpretation presuppose. In this sense, every act of communication, no matter how banal, is seen as an act of semiological creation." End quote. In these axioms, especially, the relevance of integrational theory to paremiological issues, theories, and debates should be readily apparent. In particular, we point out the problems associated with discussions of decontextualized proverbs, the indeterminacy of proverb meaning, and the numerous calls for more context in paremiological research closely parallel these same issues in integrational discussions of language and semiology in general. In integrational semiology, however, context ceases to have any theoretical basis, since text and context cannot exist independently, and meaning is always and everywhere necessarily indeterminate. And with that bon voyage, we leap into the political arena. Okay, who's next? Sinfree or Vicky?
It's me. Then after that, it's Vicky.
All
okay, right. My main interest following what David's presentation is to talk about what David himself calls decolonial integrational linguistics. That is the term that he used to describe some of the work that I do. So the label is his, it's not mine. But now the question is, why decolonial integrational linguistics? How does it link up with Southern theories? That's what I'm going to be talking about. I start off by going back to a question that we posed, me and Alice Pennycook, in 2005, page 152. And the question was, how might language start to look if an alternative conception were mapped back to the center from the periphery? Particularly in a situation in which one of the defining features of the contemporary world is its uncertainty, as Carlson and Apple 2003 put it. The uncertainty of contemporary times creates the need to articulate innovative interpretation and to use proverbial discourses, particularly in political contexts. In this paper, we explored the nature of Southern theory and integrational linguistics. The aggregate, the combination of this is what we would call decolonial integrational linguistics in the new millennium, particularly in political context. Complexity and creativity in the use and interpretation of proverbs is typical of Southern epistemologies and decolonial integrational linguistics. Decolonial integrational linguistics emerged in reaction to colonialism, rationalism, and monocausality. The defining features of decolonial integrational linguistics that we bring to bear in our analysis of proverbial discourses are the multiple connections among the many components that constitute the reality of a formerly colonized people. Decolonial integrational linguistics is by definition a form of, in quotes, solidarity epistemology, as it seeks to establish interconnections between the many dimensions, including history, culture, society, and communicational biography, among many others. In terms of solidarity epistemology, proverbial discourses, like other forms of language practices, must be analyzed in relationship to power, history, culture, and other identities. The critique of language that we draw upon in decolonial linguistics in the Global South is to some extent founded on notions of disinvention and reconstitution of language that is compatible with integrational linguistics in the ontological perspectives it adopts towards language. In this ontological perspective, language should not be construed as something natural that simply exists as an autonomous system disconnected from private and public lives. Rather, language is a form of invention legitimized by major discursive regimes. For Makoni and Penn 2005-2020, Severo and Makoni 2021, colonialism influenced the ways that language is taught and understood. In decolonial integrational linguistics, we start from the assumption that both the languages and the major discursive regimes used to describe languages as fixed codes were originally embedded in colonial discourses and practices. Further, it was through these discourses that these languages were regulated through description. In decolonial integrational linguistics, we explored the role of what Walter Mignolo refers to as resistance, disruption, and disciplinary disobedience. The decolonization of sociolinguistics and the development of decolonial integrational linguistics is part of a broader effort to develop what Stravinsky refers to as a decolonial imagination. Decolonial integrational linguistics, as reflected in our current work, should be understood as part of a tradition of anti-imperial scholarship from the perspective of voices frequently excluded in the scholarship in the Global North. In our current paper, we seek to challenge what Colonial, drawing upon the work of Pauline Hontonji, refers to as extraverted sociolinguistics. Extraverted sociolinguistics and scholarship is the tendency to understand colonial and post-colonial societies through concepts proposed in the metropole, to understand the metropole using methods developed in the metropole. The emphasis on interconnectedness is part of our general interest in developing a solidarity-based epistemology, or what we referred to earlier on as connected sociolinguistics. The ultimate objective of a decolonial sociolinguistics that we are putting across is to fight what Schilliam would call epistemic injustice, causing us to recognize that colonialism led to an erasure of cultural memory as part of epistemicide, which is one of the consequences of colonialism. A decolonization of communication through decolonial integrational linguistics is feasible if communication and the use of proverbs are construed as an integration of human activities that are contextually integrated by employing science. Good. Then I hand over to Vicky for the most important part of the presentation.
So basically, from the introduction you have had, the key points that I can say is that the person is important, and the unique context is important. That the proverb that the approach we had taken previously had some issues. So as a background, what we are calling Jama wa Vitendawili is a paper that it was written by Margaret Baraza and Vicky Khasandi, and it's about a Kenyan politician called Raila Amolo Odinga, who is the chief, who was the chief opposition candidate. a presidential candidate. Actually, it's alleged that for every election, he has always won, but he has always been rigged out somehow and using various ways of systems. The last election, 27, he believed himself to have won. So he swore himself in. When President Uhuru Kenyatta was sworn in as president, he swore himself in as the people's president. And he gave Uhuru such a hard time that they had to come to something they call a handshake. But so the paper was about the Uhuru's partner at that time. It's amazing how things change in Kenya. They were enemies with they were friends with the current vice president. So what happened was that we used that idea that they asked you, what's your theoretical framework? So he said, oh, well, this looks like a nice theory on metaphors. So we used the Johnson and Lakoff's 1990 conceptual metaphor theory. However, it's very abstract, and it looks at things very much in abstract in abstract way. But according to how we've been told by David Bade, that actually, even the way Finnegan looked at it, he said the proverb is actually supposed to be in the how the local people perceive it themselves. So taking a theory that's from another place and in another context and trying to force our metaphors into it, our riddles into it, didn't work very well. So as we are looking at this paper, yeah, so sorry. So it's just a continuation, but we've already been told about Finnegan, and she said that whether or not some attractive saying is regarded, okay, so let's go to Jamaa Bitandawili. This talking about the cognitive analysis provided therein implies that the proverbial discourses investigated are better understood through positing a hypothetical abstract mental form that is not available to the speakers themselves, and furthermore, that this abstract level is provided in the English language. So there was a bit of challenge on that, and the observation by David and the rest of us is that the explanatory value of that paper is found not in the analysis based on Lakoff and Johnson's conceptual metaphor theory, but in Khasandi-Telewa and Barasa's discussion of situations and attitudes. So we say that we are critical of the universalism implied in the cognitive metaphor theory because we regard its universalism as being a barely concealed imperial imposition and interpretation produced by a group of Euro-American scholars, which by its very abstractness and claim to universalism erases the experiences of all speakers. And it is from this grand erasure of other people's experiences, as Manyolo, a leading Colonial scholar, puts it, that this paper seeks to depart. So we are departing from the conceptual metaphor theory and now trying to use integrationism as we have been told. So there we have that fellow who is referred to as Jamaa Bitandawili. That picture there, the smiling gentleman is called Odinga. And we said he's often derided. And since riddling is usually associated with children and not serious matters of state, yet we note that the riddles that he talks about are not childish. In fact, he talks about very serious issues using riddles and just tries to make it easier on the people he's attacking because we laugh at it, the humor in it, but in the process, he's making very serious points. So I'm going to select a few proverbs. I couldn't put all of them here, but I just selected a few. The first one is in Kiswahili. It says, alibisha akafunguliwe mlango, alipoingia akanyakua nyumba kuwa yake. Nani? It says that he knocked to be allowed in, but when he entered, he took over the house. And who is that? It's a defector trying to feel at home. So he said that this house that you can see there, it doesn't look very attractive, but it's a very nice house. He says the house, the political party was, the country was built by Raila and Kibaki, the former president. They put up when the country was almost on fire due to post-election violence, they worked together to rebuild the country. But then when Jubilee came in, the current president and other people came in, they kicked him out of the house. So the time he was campaigning, he felt like this camel had come in his house and kicked out the owner. So he was using that, the riddle and the story behind it, but he was discussing political things and showing that he should be given a chance to go back to parliament, to power, because he had been kicked out by newcomers. So we had used the conceptual metaphor theory and talked about the source domain and which was abstract. And we had used the metaphor, life is a container. According to Johnson and Lakoff, they have this general metaphor that the others derive from. So the general metaphor is called life is a container. And then from there now, you can see like being kicked out of the house. So from an integrational point of view, however, it would appear that positing an abstract universal concept underlying Raila Amolo Odinga's riddle cannot survive Ockman's razor. The principle that of two explanations that account for all the facts, the simpler one is more likely to be correct. The abstraction removes Amolo's thought process away from his and his audience's participation in Kenyan politics towards a mental construct in which neither Raila Amolo Odinga nor Kenya has any existence. What we mean is that the analysis that proverb is given using conceptual metaphor theory does not, is too round, that you have to go first of all to life is a container, then you bring it back to the Kenyan situation. So we are critiquing that and saying, well, this conceptual metaphor theory may supply life is a container, but we doubt whether Raila Amolo or any of his audience would have summed up the riddle going around the abstract way. To them, it is just clear that he just gives an example that they can understand. A camel is so big, says, can I just put my hoof in the house? Once the hoof was in, he said, can I just put my tail in? Once the tail in, finally he said, this house is too small for us, and kicked the owner out. So it's more lively in the Kenyan politics than to go conceptually and all that kind of thing. So we decided to leave that out and just use integrationism. And of course, this has also been critiqued not only in Kenya, but in Africa, but even in the North's history. We know that houses and vehicles take on a significance different from that which the history of the West has accorded to them. The house in history form is not so much a container for life as a place of convergence and not in a mesh of comings and goings. This is, of course, by Tim Angold when he talks about the Sami, the northern people in Finland, and that place, the northern people. To them, the concept of a house is not the same as what the Americentric and English people would have. So when trying to say that this applies universal, it doesn't always capture other people's experiences. So now let's go to the proverbs in the African political discourse. Just as a background, I would point out that unlike in the USA, where people are either Republican, Democratic, or independent, I don't know if there are others outside. I think if you're not in those, maybe you're independent. In Kenya, alliances are so fluid that on one day people can be hurling insults at each other, and on the next day they are bedfellows. What matters is which side of the bread is buttered on for that particular season. These political associations involving forming alliances and shifting here and there are accompanied by lots of debates, many of them laced with apt proverbs, summarizing one's displeasure, mocking or justification for their choices, including the consequences. When this was written in 2017, Raila Amolo Odinga was out, the one kicked out of the house, and the current deputy president and the president were bedfellows. Right now, as we're talking in 2021, Raila and the president are bedfellows, and now Ruto is outside trying to be brought back in. So that's how quickly you change. You just look at the battered side and you move with it. So in these sections, we examine some of the proverbs used among the Luya. Luya is a group in the western part of Kenya. It's a big group, ethnic group, and we pick those proverbs just by choice, just randomly. Of course, it's easier for me because I know them very well. I also do Swahili proverbs, I do others, but these ones I picked are mostly Luya ones to express the various political tides, especially during election campaigns. A common theme in these proverbs is one to do with consumption. They are either eating or drinking. Someone commented and said it's only in Kenya where people eat money. So money has been eaten, money has been, maize has been, petrol has been eaten. When something goes missing, we say it's eaten or it has been drunk. So many of our metaphors here are talking about eating or drinking or marriage or that kind of thing, but they are really referring to political alliances. So we are going to look at a brief, just one or two proverbs about from the perspective of those who defect from one party to another or shift alliances. Then you're going to look at those from the perspective of those left behind and how they feel. And then we are going to look at it from the perspective of those who woo others and move them to the camp. Then we are going to finish off with the handshake, which was the master defection. So the first one group is about proverbs around defecting to other parties. This first proverb says, "Enjendeho ebudebe abetanganende eshimuhirayo." When you hear someone talk of going somewhere, there must be a reason for this. This proverb was used, there was a gentleman called Martin Shikuku, who was a great critic of the government. And then one time he was seen in State House. So what did he go to do in State House? People started saying they started smelling a rat. They said, when you hear someone talk of going somewhere, there must be something that's attracting them. So it's a telltale signs of someone who's about to defect. Or he never really defected, but he became very mild. After eating ugali in State House, he stopped being so critical of the government. So that one, when you see someone starting to talk to someone, you say, there's something is cooking here. Like where there's smoke, there's fire. Then the other one says, "Otemberesia watesha." If you want to marry, you have to woo the girl. So when you see the people coming to you, if you are a politician, groups being sent to you, trying to woo you with money, doing meetings in your place, raising money and all that, they are trying to woo someone like this lovely African girl. If you want to woo her, you have to come with some persuasion. You don't just come empty-handed. So the next is from the perspective of former associates of defectors, those that are left behind. They would say, most of these proverbs are from these people who feel so bad that they've been left behind. Maybe they would have liked to have been the one approached, or they feel bad that someone you are fighting on the same side with has crossed the street and gone to the other side. So they say, "Amakumba kabiri kakana kanya imbwa." It means that the two bones confounded the dog. This is to warn potential defectors. You know the story of the dog that was carrying a big bone, and as it was crossing the river, it saw the reflection of itself in the river and said, "That's a bigger bone than the one I have." So as it went to grab the other bone, it ended up losing the bone. So here Raila was using this proverb also to a similar proverb in Kisi, where he saw an erstwhile strong supporter of his had suddenly turned to, was looking like he was defecting. He had actually defected. He was called Chris Obure. So he used this kind of proverb similar to this, showing that it's like you are trying to get two things at the same time. You want to have your cake and to eat it, you're going to lose. So he says the two bones confounded the dog. The other one, he says that the vegetables you despise are the same that will satisfy you. The food that we eat mostly in Kenya is called ugali. Some other African countries call it something else, saza and all that. But you can be given a big ugali and very little vegetable. So you say, will this be enough for me? These vegetables are not enough. Then because you are hungry, you manage to eat all that ugali with just that little vegetable. So it's a way of saying that you can despise something and say this thing is no good, but suddenly it's so good for you. So it's enough for you. So you can find someone who was criticizing this one and saying they are bad, there's nothing good in them. Suddenly, they are satisfying their needs of that person. They also say, "Inzofu ifutarahoya anyekwa." And you can see that African elephant there. If you joke with it, it will crush you. So an elephant is insulted only when it has turned its back. So even if you're a defector and you have defected, people don't shout at you and say you defector. They fear you still if you are a powerful person like an elephant. So they just whisper, they'll whisper, they are complaining, but they don't call you, they don't insult you, might destroy them. So that's another one. So these people who are left behind, former associates, can grumble and complain, but it's not easy sometimes to confront the person directly. Maybe that's why Raila would use riddles. And they would also say, "Amache kaweresia chiswa." The crawling soldier termites deceived the flying white ants that all was well outside. If you look at this little life cycle, the soldier there is not very attractive and nobody eats. We don't eat that one. But the one they are calling the alert, that the one with the wings, is now edible. So when it rains and they start flying out, we gather them and we eat them for our food. They're very delicious. So someone can cheat you that outside is peaceful, but when you come out, you find life is not easy. So they usually tell someone, don't just follow these people, stay inside and check carefully. They might be deceiving you that outside is peaceful. When you leave this party and go outside, you'll end up suffering. So be cautious, stay put, don't defect. They try to persuade you. The next one is Imbongo ihasi ayayirula isakula obukono. Imbongo is like a female deer, like that one you can see in the picture. They say that when it's moving, it doesn't just move, it destroys the layer before departing. So these are people who, when they want to leave a party, they don't just go in peace, they destroy everything. They say it's bad, they say bad things about the party and they move. So this proverb is used to show someone who is leaving a party and giving the dog a bad name before destroying it. So they say the female deer destroys her lair before departing. And then that fat frog there is called ometadishere. It says, ometadishere kumalokudia kokwaruma. It means that frog is so big, it's so fat. It says, look at how Ometa, the fat frog, jumps when he has eaten. The defectors are usually mocked. They are told that for them to have left their party to go to another, they must have been given something to eat. So they are, so you fat frogs, you have been given money, that's why you have defected, you have abandoned the cause. So they are told, if you hear it in the language, it sounds very funny because you're actually being insulted. And then they also say that isuna is a mosquito that you can see there. Eating caused the mosquito to die. The mosquito was so keen on sucking blood from someone that he got slapped to death. It goes, woo, woo, woo. You hit here, you miss, finally you get it. Instead of running away the first time, it still insists. So say you can be insisting that you want to eat, then you commit political suicide. And then the other one, the dog and the bone says, Olasangarira ohukavwa di kumba. Do not be excited by the big bone that you have been given. In other words, you've only been given a bone. You know, they deceive you, they give you just a little money, and then you leave your purpose and your party and go to join them. What you'll be given is just a dry bone. Once you get there, you'll not get what you need. They'll just deceive you, and as we shall see, once you're in the camp, it's different. And they also are told, feed and be complacent. If you are defected and gone to another party and then you try to talk, they'll tell you, what are you trying to tell us? You just feed quietly. You have gone where the food is, go and feed quietly. Don't say anything. You have no moral authority to question anything. You have already sold out your soul. And they also tell them, but be careful because so they say that he who feeds you can beat your mother in your presence. So as you have no voice. Once you're in someone's hand, once you have eaten from someone, you have no freedom. You are not yourself anymore. Like, you know, for example, like now I can use Raila himself. He has gone to the party of the government now, the handshake. Corruption is happening. He can't say much because now he's inside. He can be told, eat quietly, don't say anything, just eat. You cannot say anything because you are now eating. You're inside, you are eating. So he who feeds you can beat your mother in your presence. You are helpless on your own. And this one, they say, and then these people, you are still expected to be silent. You speak, you're told be quiet. And when you are quiet, you are told, even if you remain silent, I've still messed you up. So so they just provoke you, you are voiceless. And then finally they say, when your wife refuses you and wants to leave, she will accuse you of witchcraft. That is the same as the layer that the female deer that ruins the layer before she leaves. So when you hear someone saying bad things about a place where they have been, it's because maybe it's just fake. They say, why are you leaving this guy? He's such a good guy. Say, oh, that guy is a witch. He's a wizard, you see. But it's just because someone doesn't want you anymore. So if someone doesn't want you, let them go. So that is from the view of those who are left behind. You can't believe that and we have had cases like those. There's someone called Ababu Namwamba, very virulent, ODM itself, or Raila's party. Then one day, I think he had some money, they moved, and now he was on the government side. So the people left behind had all these proverbs to talk about him. And the defectors themselves can say, decides that caterpillar and it's bad. They say a bad thing must be spat out. Even the hen spat out the caterpillar. They say if something is bad, you have to go. You don't have to stay if it's bad. So they will justify their living by saying that it's like a caterpillar which can't be swallowed. It has to be spat out. And then those who woo them in, the ones who persuade you to defect also have proverbs for themselves. They can say, for example, Olulimil serera shuligo loluteshata. Literally, the tongue that woos is not the one that marries, meaning the language of courtship is not the same as the language of marriage. This one was particularly Moi, who was the former president. Moi was very fond of this. He would come and persuade people, come join my party, I'll give you vice presidency, I'll give you vice presidency. Once you are inside, you say, oh no, that was just the language of wooing. I don't have to keep the promises. You're now in the house. Once you're in the house, I don't need to give you anything, you're already here. So you feel so helpless. So they say, of course, when you are wooing someone, you're allowed to lie. Promise them heaven. Once they get there, they find nothing. Or they say, meaning is if you drop a bird while it's saying, it will surely fly away. So they don't come to you and say, we are only trying to persuade you to leave your party and come to ours. Then we'll give you nothing. They lie to you, we'll give you everything. So they have to pretend until you are inside the house. Once you are inside, they can now go and look for another person. And they can also say, meaning that this is an interesting one. He says that the person who lied to his in-laws is rained on rather than shelter at the in-laws' place. When it starts raining here, maybe in the open field, you run to the nearest house and you shelter. Humukuru means on the house there outside where the roof you are covered a bit. But now if you went and lied to someone, you can't shelter there because you'll be caught. So you just suffer quietly and keep going. You'll be rained on as you go because your in-laws, you lie to them, so you cannot be free to, you are no longer free. In other words, basically this idea of defecting takes away someone's peace and peace of mind. And you can see that some of them are, some proverbs are supporting, some of them are opposing. So finally, the last slide is about the handshake. This was a master case of where we have said in Kenya that things really changed. As I said, that Uhuru was sworn in as the president and Raila swore himself in as the people's president because he felt that he was talking about computer chicks. He says, Vifaranga vya computer, meaning that he believes that Uhuru never won the elections, but he just cooked the elections using computer figures. So he said he's swearing himself in. So the country was in chaos. It never got to fighting like 2017, but a few people were killed. It was going to be really bad. So Uhuru used all those tactics and got Raila to his side. And one day we just woke up in the morning and found a handshake. People were so shocked because these people are arch enemies. How did they suddenly end up with that mighty handshake? It was so sensational that even the president of the US was so happy. He called them, invited them for the 68th National Prayer Breakfast meeting in Washington to share their handshake story, and hopefully this handshake could be applied to other warring parties. So we can see that, and then Raila, of course, used that riddle. He also used back his own riddle, your own riddle. He said, here in America, you say that any jackass can kick down a barn, but it takes a good carpenter to build one. So you can see that Raila actually is a fellow of riddles. He likes riddles. In every occasion, on every occasion, he tries to use a riddle to show it. So basically, that was the few proverbs I selected. There are more about, but for our purposes, this will show us the various proverbs that are better looked at just in their context, using integrationism, the people themselves, and their own. Some of them are just transmutations from riddles, some of them from proverbs. And you can see that the person himself is at the center of it, not some abstract conceptual metaphor theory. Thank you very much. I return to Sinfree to continue from there.
I can't hear you, Sinfree. Get that mic on.
Yeah, okay, good. Yes, the idea of the paper is, like David and Vicky put it, is very simple. We decided that we are going to juxtapose, to some extent, conceptual metaphor theory and integrationist. Vicky had written a paper on conceptual metaphor, which we used as a basis. So we then were trying to see what is it that we are able to appreciate about proverbs and the Kenyan political context when we use integrational linguistics, which we are not able to capture effectively when we are using conceptual metaphor. So that was the key argument which was there. We then were trying to argue that by analyzing proverbs using integrational linguistics, it will give us an opportunity to get back to a discussion about what constitutes layperson perspectives in integrationism. So the aim there was to see if you were to ground notions about lay perspectives in integrationism, what are the various meanings of this particular term in integrational linguistics. And the point we were making, which we're seeking to make, there is that proverbs don't have fixed meaning. The meanings are always provisional and constantly being negotiated, a phenomenon that becomes quite obvious when you bring in a layperson's interpretation of what is taking place. David, do you want to add something on this?
Well, when I was going through the literature on Proverbs, one of the almost constant themes is how Proverbs are considered to be things past. It is ancient wisdom. It's time immemorial. It's custom and tradition, and people are always backward looking. That's the whole discussion of Proverbs is focused on pre-existing linguistic forms. Okay, frozen, archaic, stereotypical kind of language. Now, what I read in Vicky's first paper was how that they were all responding to a current situation, and they were responding to it in hoping to change things. It was not some past reaffirmation of the past, not some archaic ritual continually re-performed. They were all trying to change the world to make it better. And now, of course, in Vicky's discussion, the changing alliances, people can have a proverb asking for change one day and use a different proverb the next day to justify repeating all the sins of the past. It's not like proverbs are necessarily past or necessarily future or bound to the present. They are things people use to make their life what it is. You know, they're connecting the past with the future in their present, but it's not something so stuck to the past. And one of the things that really struck me was there's a passage from Marx in the 18th Brumaire where he says, men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. Well, that's, you know, we all live in a world we didn't create. You know, we were born into a world that was already there. But what it becomes through our own actions. And we are responsible for the future. And in the Proverbs here, for good or for bad, for conservatives and for revolutionaries, all of these proverbs were used to imagine a future. That was what was really striking. And that goes against virtually everything you read in the literature about Proverbs.
So the Proverbs there were more or less like provisional statements about a future, rather than linguistic fossils about knowledge situated in the past. Right.
Exactly. They're people that are making a judgment about the present based on their grandparents and great-grandparents or parents, you know, having experienced similar kind of political situations and life situations, but they're not trying to put us back into the grandpa's world. They're saying that, you know, things do stay the same, they need to change.
They need to change, yes, yes, yes. So they're legitimizing the call to change this by using proverbs. Right.
They're moving the past into a future.
Into
That's
the
how
future.
I put
Yes,
it.
yes, yes, yes. So in a way, what is interesting there is that indeterminacy about a proverb, which is really very helpful in talking about the role that proverbs may play in an African context. If you take it just structurally, then proverbs don't help you very much in a context which is uncertain. Right. If you think of proverbs simply as having a fixed meaning in the past, that doesn't help you to see how people use proverbs creatively in the present moment.
Yes, and I, you know, where Harris talks about the indeterminacy of,
yes,
of particular words or structured sentences, whatever. Proverbs are really interesting.
They're really indeterminate. They're really indeterminate
because they are almost universally considered to be fossilized phrases.
Yes, but they are,
but in fact,
in practice,
they're used to critique the past and point to the. That is really the indeterminacy of proverbs. I mean, you can't get more. More, in a sense, fossilized and strictly determined forms. But they're not. They're not. They're used in very creative ways. I mean, Vicky's discussion of termites and frogs. And I mean, to talk about a political situation, you got to be pretty creative to talk about termites and frogs and camels.
Yes. And what is interesting about proverbs, which illustrates the nature of the complex relationship between a speaker and their language, is that the same different individuals may appeal to the same proverbs, but for radically different purposes. They want to accomplish radically different things, but then they are saying that they're using the same proverb, right?
Actually, my initiation into African proverbs was 30 years ago when I was in library school. I took a course in Africana bibliography with Yvette Skaven. Her husband was a specialist in Swahili proverbs, African proverbs in general. But and Albert Skaven, he was really interested in the use of politics in Tanzanian society where he was. And his interest lay in how they would duel, how they would argue with proverbs. In an argument, answering one proverb with another proverb. And you know, that was just a marvelous, for me to think about that. And I thought about it for 30 years until you asked me to do this paper. So this was the chance to actually follow up on the late Albert Skaven's contribution to my own interests in life.
Okay, I've been asked by Christine to chair the rest of the session. There are a couple of questions since she has experienced some technical problems. She asked me to do it. So thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for a great paper, really very interesting. Also, Peter Jones says hello and thanks a lot to you for a great paper. Okay, there's a question here by Johan Siebers. I guess I could direct it to Vicky. The question is, are proverbs rhetorical commonplaces?
I hope Vicky.
Yes. I was just leaving the office. That's why
there's a question for you.
Yeah, just again, sorry.
Okay.
Yes,
so the question is, are proverbs rhetorical commonplaces?
Commonplaces. Thank you for the question. I can't completely say they are commonplace, but they are generally, you would understand it. Even if you didn't know the exact meaning, most people have some shared knowledge about it that they can understand what the person must be alluding to. They use the animals and You look at, this, or this frog, for example, this fat frog, that's obviously not a very pleasant thing to say, or that kind of thing. So it may not be very common, but there's some shared knowledge there that anyone can actually understand it. But actually, it's a very nice way of talking. Everyone wants to talk with a proverb because it's just use one proverb and
Okay, we lost you at the end, the last bit. We didn't hear that.
Yeah, I think she was trying to say that it's the use of proverbs permeates society quite, penetrates society quite deeply. But the extent to which there is, however, individual variability in the facility or the ability of the individuals to use and manipulate proverbs may differ between individuals.
Yes. Okay, very good. Thanks, Vicky.
One thing we should ask there is the notion of commonplace itself. How is that
established?
I think related to this, I have a question that I could, for example, direct to Sinfree, but also David, feel free to answer here. My question is: can proverbs be invented on the spot, or do they rely on an institutional historical dimension?
Okay, that's an excellent question. There is the assumed ideological position that runs like this, that proverbs are part of an institutional memory. But what that does is to mask the extent to which they are created at times on the spur of the moment, or how you combine different aspects to create your own proverbs as you go along. Hence my argument that some people may have a better facility in creating proverbs than others. In other words, it's not individuals who are controlled by proverbs. People control their proverbial discourses. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think there's a marvelous book by Kwesi Yankah about proverbs.
Yes.
Ghana. They have a whole institution there and an official government functionary who collects proverbs. And what is amazing about this is that in European studies of folklore and proverbs, it is always assumed that these go back centuries.
Or
they're from time immemorial. They have no author. They had an author. It was in antiquity.
Yes.
The duty of the proverb keeper of the proverbs in the Akan society is when people invent a proverb that they wish to make public, they go to the keeper of proverbs and they give him a little token, tell him the story behind the proverb, why they issued this phrase, where, when, who they are, and he keeps the token. And then he travels around from village to village and people say, what does that token mean? What's the proverb? That? And then he explains the whole situation and makes the statement, life is a bowl of cherries or whatever, whatever the proverb is. And in this fashion, he retains the originator of the proverb, the situation in which it was originally created, and passes it through the whole community so that they can all share this moment of linguistic creativity. It's astounding because they actually have an institution to keep track of where proverbs originate.
But the key thing there is that you institutionally create an illusion that that proverb was always there in the past. Right.
Yeah, that's what scholarship on proverbs. And interestingly enough, I think it is precisely that association with proverbs with time immemorial that led to proverbs being despised, beginning in the 18th century and the Enlightenment. Didn't want the past. They didn't like the past. So in Shakespeare's day, everybody wrote and used proverbs, and it was considered a badge of culture and intelligence. Much like in Africa today, using proverbs is a sign of your of your culture, your intelligence, your ability to communicate in your community, to communicate, to bridge the gap between your own grandparents, from whom you learn many of these phrases, and your grandchildren. That's a communicational skill, and it's a social necessity to connect the generations, not with bounds of chains of tradition, or what as Marx calls them, the tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living. In Africa, proverbs aren't chains weighing like a nightmare on the living. They are the life of the community that ties them together and propels them into the future that they together create. It's a this is why the study of African proverbs and the way proverbs function in Africa reveals something totally different than the scholarship of proverbs that I found anyway, when I started looking into this in European and American scholarship.
So in a way, what we're doing is that through an integrational linguistics, we are seeking to illustrate how proverbs in African context are forward looking rather than a celebration of some romantic past.
Exactly.
Excellent, very good. So I have another question here from Lizica for David. Okay, she says, when you quoted proverbs contain the moral truths in society, my question is, what's the context and the attitude here? And how do proverbs relate to Harris's ideas?
That quote was from Ademo and Balagoon, and they're referring to a very common and very influential definition by Sir Arthur Taylor from the early 20th century. That was his definition of proverbs. I was not offering that as my definition. That was the discussion to situate how proverbs are seen in Western scholarship.
Yes.
Sinfree and Vicky and I are looking at proverbs to suggest that can be one function of proverbs, but we see something very different. In fact, we see political contest and political criticism. Kwesi Yanka saw in proverbs that they almost always arose out of situations of conflict, suffering, and stress. He said they don't make proverbs in moments of contentment, joyfulness. The proverbs suggest a way out of a problem, not contentment with the way things are.
Do you think that is a universal?
Do I think what?
If it is a universal, that proverbs like they are created out of these specific contexts out of difficulty or
I don't know about
problem.
universal. I haven't lived long enough. I think it is very common that people say proverbs when you have a problem with something, and or when they see a problem and they criticize by means of a proverb. They say that this is as Vicky said, the proverbs are used when people are explaining something that they see as a problem. And of course they have their moral values, and of course they would not use a problem they would not choose a proverb that they might think suggests the opposite of their moral values. Of course they're going to use proverbs that do indicate their own beliefs, their own situation, their own idea for the future. That's why you can use proverbs. Hitler's Germany was famous for its use of proverbs. So it's not like proverbs are necessarily forward-looking and progressive. It's people use proverbs to argue for a future they want. So you could use proverbial speech in a revolutionary discourse or a counter-revolutionary discourse. That's we're not looking at Proverbs as something that have these inherent meanings that are either conservative or radical, but that it's the people who mean something when they use a proverb. It's the people who speak who are trying to imagine a future. Now that future may be one we don't want, but that's the point of arguing in Proverbs, is that you can counter their proverb with another proverb. Which they will also know that proverb, and they will have to deal with your argument.
Yeah. And I think your discussion so far has shown, we're coming back to Lizika's second question, how do proverbs relate to Harris's idea that Harrisian theory has no problem dealing with proverbs, right?
No, I think proverbs are much better elucidated by looking at them from a Harrisian standpoint of personal responsibility and creativity. And I think Kwesi Yankau's book is marvelous, a marvelous work to be read in conjunction with Harris. It's really
great. There is a question here from Johan Siebers again, who says, I think this is an interesting one. Maybe if Vicky wants to take it. Just a second. Yeah, he asks, many of these proverbs express an attitude of wary caution, self-interest, tit-for-tat cynicism. They seem based on distrust. I wonder if this says something about the current political culture.
What other political culture is there?
Vicky.
Yes. In Kenya, it's always like that. You have to be cautious all the time, and self-interest. I think that's what happens, because for the political situation shifts so much that your best ally, your strongest supporter, suddenly you find him on the other side, and you wonder how he or she jumped into the side. So many of these proverbs will try to capture that disappointment and that mood, and even those ones who went will justify themselves why they went and say, okay, it's a bad place, I have to go. Even a caterpillar has to be spat out, you don't have to swallow it. So generally it shows the general political mood. Right now, I don't even know where I belong, because I was a supporter of Raila. Now he's Uhuru. I don't know who I support anymore, so I just kept quiet. So people are really confused, and truly we have concluded that the politicians are like that. No one is to be trusted. And so many proverbs will reflect that in their expression. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a question here from Sibusizo Cliff, who asks, who besides politicians values the use of proverbs in society?
Well, do you want that from one of us or all three of us?
Okay.
You decide.
You decide. Vicky, do you want to have a go at it? I mean, the ones that we selected were politicians, but proverbs are not a special property of politicians. They are used by more or less everybody, right? Even in usual interpersonal relationships, private interpersonal relationships, people use proverbs. It might be more difficult to access proverbs used in interpersonal relationships, but we are not saying that proverbs are a special type of discourse which is only unique to politicians. That's not the argument we are making.
Yeah.
I think Vicky, in her earlier paper, that Rao learned proverbs and the way to speak in proverbs from his elders. Isn't that correct, Vicky?
Yes.
Yeah, he learned it from elders, and it's popular, especially among elders and even among school children.
Yes.
I myself am a great fan of them. People who like wisdom and shortcut. I mean, summarizing things quickly in a short expression, like to use them. In religious discourse, you could just sample proverbs in religious discourse. It's used generally all over the place. Thank you.
Yes.
See, the interesting part about our argument that we have not sort of developed is, let's say, at what age do people begin to use proverbs? And the way we are framing it is that it's likely that if you are studying youth cultures, for example, you would encounter a lot of proverbs. They would use a lot of proverbs as well, right? That these proverbs are not the special privilege of some elderly politicians. These are just part and parcel of ordinary language use.
Yeah, I think that's it. This is a way of people learning to communicate.
It's a way of people learning to communicate. Yes.
It's part of the linguistic. Now that it's especially characteristic of all of, well, most all of African cultures. I believe there are some cultures which they have claimed do not use proverbs, but that all depends on how you define proverbs.
Yes.
Yeah, I think you should definitely also look into Dorte Dunker's work on conventionalization. She's written quite a bit on that, so that is certainly, and formulaic language, so that is certainly pertinent to the whole discussion.
I a lot of Albert Lord and the Milman Perry and those folks who studied the singers of tales and the bards in the Balkans, that it was assumed that they repeated their epic tales, poems, word for word. But in fact, when they studied them, they found there was enormous variation. And they never repeated the same thing twice.
Yes.
Exactly. There's a question from Victor Dabo. Very interesting discussion. He says, are all proverbs metaphorical?
Well, there again, it depends on how you define proverbs.
And metaphorical, right?
Yes.
How you define metaphorical as well, right?
Yeah.
Great. Christine has a question. What proverbs can teach us about what counts as orality?
Let me think about that.
Vicky, do you want to answer to this?
Sinfree. Let's Sinfree answer.
Okay. Sinfree, you're on.
Okay.
Sinfree Makoni.
Yes, let me answer. Let me have a go at it. I think what you have with...
Have we lost him? Sinfree, are you there?
I'm here. Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, right. I think what you have with...
Yes, you can.
Yeah, good. What you have with orality, yes, to some extent, you have use of proverbs, etc. But orality cannot be defined solely on either the presence or absence of proverbs. The problem with that argument, though, is it gets back to the issue that David was raising at the very beginning. What constitutes a proverb? To some extent, from an integrationist perspective, that might not be a very helpful question to pose, because it forces you to try and identify what you think are the structural features that make up a proverb. But a contextual analysis of proverbs shows that is a very difficult thing to determine in advance. What are the features that make or don't make up a proverb? And by extension, it's very difficult to determine in advance what makes something oral and what makes something non-oral. Right.
Okay, thank you. There's a question from Nelly Mbaka, who asks, can I make my own proverb, or can it be conventional? But would that be a form of Humpty Dumptyism? Someone who says, I make my own proverbs?
No, you can. I mean, the example from Kwesi Yanka that David was talking about, how you make your own proverbs and you subsequently, as it were in quotes, market it to the person who compiles these proverbs, is an excellent example of individual creativity that underlies the formation of proverbs.
Yes, but then we can also imagine someone else telling you, "Hey, that is not a proverb."
Exactly. Yes, exactly. So then the question becomes the issue about norms and normativity in the use of proverbs. That's where it then leads you to.
Yes. Very good. Thanks. Yes.
Problem in primological studies, the European style, that how do you find it in terms of they would like to say a proverb is of widespread usage and time immemorial, but how do you quantify time immemorial?
Yes.
I know that my grandmother said certain things, and I grew up with those words in my mouth, and I still say them. But whether anyone else in the world will recognize my grandmother's characteristic phrases, I don't know, and it's never a problem unless I'm talking to someone like Sinfree and mention one of my grandmother's phrases, and he says, "What the heck are you talking about?"
Excellent. There's a question from Irene Kimani. She says, "A very informative discussion. My question, does the use of proverbs signify wisdom, especially when used by politicians?"
Well, I'm not sure if politicians ever have wisdom.
That is your personal opinion, of course, right?
Yeah. I think that there are collections of proverbs which peoples have considered for instance, the biblical Proverbs, the book of Proverbs. The ancient Hebrew people considered that wisdom. And to this day, it's considered wisdom by the Jewish and Christian traditions. I'm sure that you can find the same collections of proverbs in Buddhist literature, Hindu literature, Muslim literature, Native American literatures. Wherever you go, you will find those proverbs which are considered to have stood the test of time and to reflect some kind of wisdom. But that doesn't mean that every time Ronald Reagan or Donald Trump uses a proverb, we are hearing the wisdom.
But don't only mention Democrats, Republicans, right? Also Democrats.
It's just the world I've had to live with.
Okay. Excellent. Are there any other questions that we have received from the YouTube chat, Christine? No more. Huh? No. Is it time to? I think Christine signals to me that now it's time to finish, to wrap it up. Well, let me thank you very much for this great paper. Really, and very nice discussion.
Sinfree and Vicky, you too, Adrian.
Thanks a lot, Adrian. Thanks a lot, Vicky.
Thank you. Don't go away. We need to discuss the book.
Yes.